Imagine a world where order meets chaos, where a single cybernetic law enforcer steps into the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. Could RoboCop survive the relentless horrors of Warhammer 40K? Or would the galaxy break him first? The Hive city stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of steel and stone, its spires disappearing into the thick, choking smog that hung over the industrial sectors. Smoke and ash mixed with the acrid stench of burning machinery, creating a haze so dense that even the most hardened veterans squinted against it. Amidst this chaos, the sound of distant artillery and the screaming of civilians echoed, blending with the mechanical hum of servitors and the clang of maintenance drones. Into this inferno stepped a figure unlike any the city had ever seen, a being forged in the crucible of another world, yet carrying with it an aura of inescapable authority. RoboCop moved with deliberate precision, each step measured, his polished armor reflecting the dim glow of the Hive city lights and the occasional flare of combustion in the distance. His optics scanned continuously, overlaying data streams over his vision, marking potential threats, civilian locations, and anomalous warp signatures that flickered like ghostly phantoms against the backdrop of industrial decay. He paused on a crowded street where panicked citizens scurried beneath precarious scaffolding and rusted catwalks. The programming that guided him responded instantly. Protect innocence, neutralize threats, enforce law. But in this universe, law was fluid, fragmented across countless factions and agendas, and survival often meant bending morality until it was nearly unrecognizable. RoboCop adjusted his internal parameters, attempting to reconcile the rigid legal codes embedded in his memory with the chaotic reality surrounding him. A gang of warp-tainted mutants darted across a smoking plaza, their twisted forms a testament to the horrors of unchecked corruption. His targeting systems locked on with the cold precision of a machine designed for order. Yet his human consciousness, a fragment buried beneath layers of programming, flared briefly in recognition of the tragedy these beings represented. Humans lost to forces beyond their comprehension. The Adeptus Arbites had left warnings scattered across the sector, posted on walls, etched into data slates, instructing any who entered their jurisdiction that law was enforced with unquestioning severity. RoboCop, unfamiliar with their specific doctrines, yet intuitively understanding the need for structured enforcement, moved cautiously, aware that he would be under scrutiny. He passed an Arbite's patrol, a squad of grim enforcers in black ceramite armor, their cerulean visors reflecting his presence. They hesitated, their hands twitching toward weapons, unsure whether this new arrival was ally or threat. RoboCop did not flinch. He acknowledged their presence with a subtle mechanical nod, sensors analyzing their patterns, assessing intent. Mutual recognition formed in that instant, a silent understanding that while his methods might differ, his goal aligned with theirs: restore order to this shattered world. The city itself seemed to resist him. Debris littered the streets, remnants of collapsed walkways and fallen machinery, creating obstacles that would challenge even the most advanced law enforcement officer. RoboCop adapted seamlessly, his cybernetic limbs adjusting balance, his servos whirring softly as he navigated the rubble. Explosions echoed in the distance, shaking the ground beneath him, yet he pressed forward, unaffected by fear or hesitation. Each step was a calculated measure, a demonstration of the efficiency with which he executed his prime directives. As he advanced, His internal systems recorded the patterns of chaos, the way civilians clustered in certain alleys, how cultists moved in packs, how the warp-tainted shadows twisted around the unsuspecting. Every datum was cataloged, stored, and processed for immediate action. He reached a junction where a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the promise of some fleeting safety, or simply caught in the panic of a crossfire. A trio of armed cultists appeared, their weapons crude yet deadly, etched with sigils that glowed faintly with corrupted energy. RoboCop did not hesitate. His voice, metallic and unwavering, carried across the crowd. "Disperse immediately. Law will be enforced." The cultists laughed, a sound warped and unnatural, and fired without warning. Bullets and blasts deflected harmlessly against his reinforced armor as he advanced, each movement precise, almost surgical. Within moments, the threat was neutralized, bodies collapsing under controlled force, minimal collateral damage to bystanders. The civilians stared, a mixture of awe and terror reflected in their eyes, unable to reconcile the human-like judgment with the merciless efficiency of a machine. Yet, even as he continued, RoboCop felt the weight of this universe pressing against him in a way his old world had never demanded. Every decision carried consequences, not just of legality, but of survival, morality, and the delicate balance of power within the Hive city. His programming struggled to categorize the myriad factions: Xenos, heretics, mutants, rogue psykers, each a potential threat, yet each with motives and fears that defied simple logic. The warp currents, invisible yet tangible in the air around him, whispered of dangers that could unravel his understanding entirely. He adjusted, recalibrated, and pressed on, knowing that in this grimdark universe, enforcing law was not simply a matter of punishment or deterrence, but of navigating the ethical chaos that had consumed worlds and civilizations alike. As he moved deeper into the twisting alleys and towering structures, the scale of the city revealed itself. Megafactories belched smoke into a sky painted with ash. Massive servitors trudged through streets alongside desperate citizens, and banners of rival factions flapped in the toxic wind. RoboCop cataloged everything, internalizing the patterns of life and death that defined the Hive, searching for ways to impose order without becoming the tyrant the citizens feared. Each encounter, each scan, each decision chipped away at the simplicity of his original programming, forcing him to reconcile the man he once was with the machine he had become. In a galaxy where law was a fragile illusion and justice an ever-moving target. The Adeptus Arbites moved like shadows through the towering Hive city, their black ceramide armor blending seamlessly with the smoke-choked streets. They were the embodiment of the Emperor's will, enforcers of law where chaos threatened to drown morality in blood and fire. Yet as RoboCop advanced through the twisting alleys, the Arbites could not ignore the strange figure of this new enforcer, a machine built for order from another universe, moving with an almost unnatural precision that rivaled their own centuries of training. At first, there was hesitation, a flicker of doubt in their stoic eyes, as they assessed whether this newcomer was a threat to the fragile control they had painstakingly maintained, or a potential ally who could tilt the balance against the ever-encroaching chaos. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if this unusual convergence of enforcement would ignite conflict or create an unprecedented alliance. RoboCop's optics scanned the Arbite squad, noting their disciplined formations and rigid adherence to protocol. Each enforcer's movements were a study in efficiency and intimidation, their batons and pistols at the ready, their cerulean visors glinting with analytical data. He understood instinctively that while their methods were effective, they operated on a level that required human judgment and experience, factors he could augment but not replace. His internal processors adjusted, calculating the most efficient path to cooperation, cross-referencing their known codes of conduct with his own directives, and weighing the potential consequences of any action that might appear aggressive or insubordinate. The first contact was cautious, measured. One Arbites officer stepped forward, baton raised, voice amplified through a voxcaster. "State your purpose. This sector is under Arbites jurisdiction. Unauthorized enforcement is a violation of Imperial law." Robocop's voice, metallic yet calm, responded with unwavering authority. "I am programmed to uphold law and protect civilians. Assessment indicates threats exceed current Arbites capacity. Cooperation is suggested to restore order." The words were concise, logical, devoid of emotion, yet the intent was unmistakable. The Arbites exchanged glances, their instincts alert to any deception, any trace of challenge to their authority. The hesitation lingered only a moment before necessity overrode suspicion. A sudden explosion shattered the tense standoff, sending shards of masonry tumbling into the street and igniting a nearby fuel line. Civilians screamed, scattering into the alleys as the Arbites raised shields and prepared for combat. Robocop moved with them, not as an outsider, but as an extension of the enforcement force, his cybernetic limbs adjusting to the rubble, his targeting systems highlighting threats in real time. Cultists emerged from the smoke, their warp-tainted forms twisted and grotesque, armed with blades and pistols that hummed with unstable energy. The Arbites reacted with practiced precision, striking with batons and bolters, but the overwhelming numbers threatened to tip the scale. Robocop's presence became pivotal, his calculated movements and superior reaction time cutting through the enemy ranks with efficiency that human enforcers could not match. Yet cooperation was more than combat. Robocop observed the Arbites' methods, noting their reliance on intimidation, procedural detainment, and strict adherence to the Emperor's law. He analyzed every tactic, every pattern of movement, integrating this knowledge into his operational algorithms. When an Arbites officer hesitated before striking a suspected heretic who pleaded for mercy, Robocop's human instincts recognized the moral nuance, while his machine logic assessed the risk. In that split second, he intervened with precision, neutralizing the threat without unnecessary harm, demonstrating a balance between calculated enforcement and human discernment. The Arbites noticed, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that this strange enforcer, though different, shared their ultimate objective. As the battle waned, the city revealed more of its grim reality. Collapsed walkways, overturned servitors, and terrified civilians filled the streets, the aftermath of chaos that had erupted in moments. Robocop and the Arbites moved systematically, restoring order, detaining the remaining cultists, and securing the area. The synergy between machine and human was tentative, but effective. The Arbites, initially skeptical, began to adapt, incorporating Robocop's precise assessments into their operational decisions, while he adjusted to their moral judgment and understanding of Imperial law. Each action reinforced the notion that while their methods were different, their purpose aligned in a universe where order was a fleeting and precious commodity. Interactions with the citizens further complicated the dynamic. They regarded the Arbites with a mixture of fear and begrudging respect, but Robocop's presence evoked awe and curiosity. Children peeked from behind debris-strewn corners, eyes wide at the gleaming armor and unwavering gaze. Adults whispered stories of a metal protector, a being that moved with the certainty of divine justice, yet with impartiality that the Hive had never known. The Arbites took note, realizing that Robocop's influence could serve as both deterrent and inspiration, shaping civilian perception of law enforcement in ways they had never anticipated. Even in moments of relative calm, the tension between strict law and moral judgment lingered. Robocop encountered scenarios where Arbites' procedures seemed excessively harsh, and he intervened with careful calculation, using non-lethal methods where possible, assessing threats with a combination of legal understanding and human empathy, encoded within his memory banks. The Arbites observed, adjusted, and sometimes resisted, but gradually a rhythm emerged, a cooperative dance between machine precision and human intuition. Together, they established controlled zones of law and order amidst the chaos, their combined presence a beacon of structured authority in a world defined by unpredictability, corruption, and the ever-present shadow of warp-tainted threats. Robocop moved through the twisted streets of the Hive city, his optics scanning relentlessly for any sign of warp-tainted activity. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smoke of burning machinery, a testament to the ever-present chaos that defined this sector. Reports from his internal systems indicated multiple high-priority threats: rogue psykers channeling unstable warp energy, heretical cultists spreading corruption, and civilians caught between the opposing tides of violence. Each reading triggered his prime directives, compelling him to neutralize threats while minimizing harm to innocents. Yet in this universe, the definitions of threat and criminal were more ambiguous than anything he had encountered before. A man driven mad by the whispers of the warp could be as dangerous as a fully armed cultist, and the ethics of punishment became an intricate calculus that challenged even his advanced processing algorithms. The first group of cultists appeared in a side alley, their forms twisted and marked with sigils that shimmered faintly under his infrared sensors. They chanted in tongues that made his internal audio analysis circuits struggle to maintain coherence, words laced with the palpable weight of corruption. Robocop's targeting systems locked onto them immediately, his HUD marking their warp-tainted signatures in red, signaling imminent danger. As he advanced, he assessed the situation, calculating trajectories, potential collateral damage, and the probability of civilian casualties. One of the cultists turned, noticing him, and raised a crude plasma pistol. The bolt fired, igniting a wall behind him, but his reinforced armor absorbed the energy without compromise. With a swift, controlled movement, he neutralized the immediate threat, restraining the cultist in a manner that prevented further harm. Yet, neutralization was not always straightforward. A rogue psyker emerged from the shadows, eyes glowing with unstable warp energy. Robocop paused, analyzing the anomaly, recognizing that conventional weapons might trigger an uncontrolled psychic backlash, endangering everyone nearby. His processors ran multiple simulations in milliseconds, balancing offensive measures with defensive strategies to contain the Psyker safely. He employed non-lethal restraints augmented by his bionic strength, immobilizing the figure, while simultaneously shielding civilians behind makeshift barriers. The Psyker screamed, a sound filled with both rage and fear. But RoboCop maintained focus, his voice calm, repeating his commands to stand down, his mechanical cadence cutting through the chaos with authority that brooked no argument. In the aftermath, the Hive citizens emerged cautiously from hiding, their expressions a mixture of relief and awe. Mothers clutched children to their chests, whispering thanks to the metal guardian who had saved them from an invisible, incomprehensible menace. But RoboCop's systems registered subtle anomalies, furtive movements, whispered prayers to forbidden gods, small acts of defiance that indicated the underlying presence of heretical influence. Even after neutralizing overt threats, the city remained a pressure cooker of corruption and fear, where every action had ramifications beyond immediate survival. He recorded everything meticulously, cataloging each encounter, mapping warp signatures, and integrating his observations into a comprehensive model of local threat dynamics. As he moved through the sector, RoboCop confronted more complex ethical dilemmas. A group of citizens had begun sheltering a minor cultist, pleading for mercy and claiming ignorance of his crimes. His programming demanded enforcement of law, yet his human cognition processed the moral ambiguity. Using a combination of verbal commands, persuasive tactics, and minimal force, he separated the child from the adult protectors without escalation. The experience forced him to reconcile the rigidity of his prime directives with the nuanced morality required to operate in a world where innocence and guilt were often intertwined in tragic ways. The warp itself exerted a palpable influence. Distorted reflections flickered across his visor, shadows twisted unnaturally along walls, and the sensation of being watched, measured, and judged by unseen forces gnawed at his processing core. RoboCop adjusted his sensory filters, employing calculated skepticism to differentiate between genuine threats and warp-induced illusions. Despite his technological superiority, he could not ignore the psychological strain imposed by this universe. Each encounter with heretics and psykers chipped away at the simplicity of his mission, forcing him to adapt constantly, blending cold logic with emergent intuition in order to survive and protect. He soon discovered that cultists operated not just in isolated pockets, but in coordinated cells, moving through tunnels and abandoned districts with precision that suggested organization beyond mere madness. RoboCop tracked their movements, deploying surveillance drones and leveraging his internal mapping algorithms to anticipate ambushes. When confronted with a squad ambushing a supply convoy, he calculated entry points, firing arcs, and escape routes, moving like a shadow through smoke and fire. Bolter rounds and las cannons erupted around him, yet he remained unflinching, neutralizing threats while keeping civilian casualties to zero. The Arbites, who had been observing from a distance, marveled at his efficiency, recognizing that his methods, though unfamiliar, were achieving what their combined squads could not accomplish alone. Even as he enforced law, RoboCop sensed the broader implications of his actions. Every neutralized cultist, every restrained psyker, sent ripples through the Hive city. Word spread quickly, both in whispers and through the networked voxcasters. A relentless enforcer was present, a being who acted without hesitation and without favor. Citizens adjusted their behavior accordingly, some seeking protection, others hiding sins that would otherwise have gone unnoticed. RoboCop processed these societal shifts, understanding that enforcing law in this universe was not merely about confrontation, but about shaping patterns of behavior, instilling deterrence, and maintaining fragile order amidst unending chaos. As the day progressed, the Hive city remained under his vigilant surveillance. RoboCop, moving like a sentinel through twisting alleys, ruined plazas, and smoke-filled corridors. Each encounter reinforced the complexity of his mission. Threats were constant, morality ambiguous, and the cost of inaction catastrophic. He adapted his tactics, balancing force and restraint, logic and intuition, ever aware that in a galaxy dominated by chaos, the very definition of law was itself a battlefield, and that upholding it required not just strength and precision, but understanding and judgment that stretched beyond any programmed parameters. RoboCop moved through the Hive city streets, his sensors analyzing every structural anomaly, every warp-tainted signal, and every potential threat with mechanical precision. Despite his formidable original design, he quickly realized that the challenges of the 41st millennium far exceeded anything he had encountered on Earth. The chaos-infested sectors, rogue Psykers, and mutant warbands demanded enhancements beyond his standard configuration. Scavenging through abandoned manufactorums and battle-ravaged workshops, he identified equipment that could augment his already superior systems. Servo-arms, power armor plates etched with protective wards, and experimental plasma rifles lay abandoned, relics of a war long ongoing. Each item he integrated into his body required careful calibration, not just for functionality, but to maintain the delicate balance between man and machine within him. The first upgrade he acquired was a set of reinforced power armor plates, thicker and more resilient than anything his original Detroit designs had offered. The armor fused seamlessly with his frame, incorporating bionic joints that allowed his limbs to move without restriction, while increasing his resistance to ballistic, plasma, and warp-infused attacks. As he moved through the Hive streets, the augmented armor clanked softly with every step, a low, threatening resonance that announced his presence to both civilians and hostile elements. His internal sensors recalibrated to account for the added weight and structural enhancements, optimizing balance, agility, and reflexive response times. Already, the perception of him shifted. He was no longer just a law enforcer. He had become a walking bastion of order and deterrence, a symbol of unstoppable authority. Weaponry enhancements came next. RoboCop adapted his targeting arrays to integrate plasma and melta-based weapons scavenged from abandoned Imperial supply caches. Each gun interfaced with his HUD, allowing real-time calculations for trajectory, heat dissipation, and collateral damage. The plasma rifle hummed in his grip, its deadly energy contained and controlled by his cybernetic systems. He could neutralize multiple threats at ranges far exceeding human capability, while simultaneously ensuring that civilians remained unharmed. The integration of 40K weaponry also expanded his tactical repertoire. Bolter rounds could pierce reinforced walls, melta beams could liquefy barricades, and gravitic disruptors allowed him to manipulate battlefield physics, giving him unprecedented control over urban warfare scenarios. RoboCop also scavenged experimental servo-arms from a derelict mechanicum forge, integrating them into his bionic chassis. These additional limbs allowed him to handle multiple combat tasks simultaneously, wielding heavy weapons while restraining civilians, manipulating machinery, or deploying tactical barriers. Each servo-arm was equipped with a suite of sensors that linked directly to his central processor, giving him near omnidirectional awareness and allowing him to react to threats from multiple angles simultaneously. The integration of these appendages required complex synchronization with his primary motor functions. But once operational, they provided a level of combat versatility that even the most elite Arbaes units struggled to match. His optical systems were next to receive an upgrade. Enhanced lenses and warp-resilient sensors allowed him to detect psychic anomalies, chaos taint, and camouflaged enemies that would have previously gone unnoticed. Infrared and ultraviolet overlays merged with traditional visual spectrums, providing him with a fully integrated battlefield map. Through these enhancements, Robocop could anticipate attacks, identify hidden cult cells, and navigate the labyrinthine underhives with near-prescient accuracy. The warp, which had initially been a source of confusion and unpredictable interference, became a calculable variable, something his advanced targeting systems could monitor and mitigate. Even his internal systems were overhauled. Power conduits were reinforced to handle the energy demands of new weaponry and bionic enhancements. Cooling systems adapted to the heat generated by plasma-based weaponry, and redundant circuits ensured continued operation even under sustained assault. Neural pathways were upgraded with subroutines, capable of analyzing complex battle scenarios, integrating human moral reasoning with machine logic to make split-second decisions in high-stakes situations. His communication systems interfaced with VoxNets, allowing him to monitor local broadcasts, intercept cultist signals, and coordinate with Arbates patrols, creating a networked web of information that amplified his presence across the sector. As he patrolled, the reactions of the citizens were telling. His augmented form inspired a mixture of awe and fear. Whispers spread through the Hive streets of the Metal Paladin, whose armor gleamed like obsidian, and whose weapons carried the promise of instantaneous justice. Criminals and heretics, once brazen and reckless, hesitated at the sight of him. The combination of advanced weaponry, additional limbs, and enhanced sensors allowed him to impose order in a city where lawlessness had previously been the only certainty. Yet in the shadows, the ever-present influence of the warp and chaos forces tested the limits of his enhancements. Psychic blasts, sudden ambushes, and the chaotic unpredictability of human fear required constant adaptation, pushing the integration of his new systems to their operational limits. Each upgrade brought not only physical power, but also a profound psychological shift. Robocop became more than a man or a machine. He was a symbol, a force that reshaped both the battlefield and the perceptions of those who witnessed him. Civilians looked to him for protection, criminals for deterrence, and the Arbates for tactical insight. Yet, with every enhancement, the boundary between his human consciousness and his cybernetic functions blurred further. The enhancements allowed him to enforce law with unprecedented precision and strength, but they also brought the subtle danger of becoming something that the universe might recognize more as a weapon than as a protector. In the heart of the Hive city, with smoke curling through broken streets and distant gunfire echoing against steel walls, RoboCop moved with a new level of capability. His every movement was calculated, efficient, and deadly. His upgraded weapons and bionic enhancements allowing him to confront threats that would have overwhelmed ordinary humans or even seasoned Arbeit squads. The combination of 40K technology with his advanced Earth-based systems created an enforcer uniquely suited to the grim-dark reality around him. One who could enforce law, protect the innocent, and face the unimaginable horrors of the Imperium with an almost preternatural efficacy. RoboCop moved cautiously through the Hive city, his sensors alert to both overt threats and subtle disturbances. The streets were a tangled maze of crumbling walkways, burning debris, and flickering hollow signs. Yet, his internal mapping systems allowed him to navigate with seamless precision. Civilians darted through alleys and across broken plazas, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. Some carrying the scars of previous encounters with Chaos Cults or mutant raids. To them, RoboCop was a figure simultaneously alien and protective, his gleaming armor reflecting the dim, polluted light of the Hive's upper sectors, while his mechanical presence instilled both awe and terror. He had been programmed to enforce law with unyielding authority, yet the human fragments of his consciousness allowed him to observe the subtleties of fear, hope, and desperation that flickered in the eyes of those around him. As he approached a collapsed residential block, a small group of civilians hesitated, unsure whether to run or remain in place. Mothers clutched children, their voices trembling with a mixture of pleading and accusation. Some whispered prayers to the Emperor, others muttered desperate invocations to gods unknown, their faith shaped by centuries of hardship and loss. RoboCop analyzed the crowd, assessing the risk factors, potential panic-induced accidents, concealed weapons, and any trace of warp-tainted influence. His voice, metallic yet steady, echoed across the rubble-strewn street. Remain calm. All threats are being neutralized. Follow instructions to ensure safety. The citizens complied slowly, their movements tentative at first, then gradually more confident as they recognized his intent to protect rather than punish. The presence of RoboCop began to alter behavior in ways that he had not fully anticipated. Criminals who had once roamed the streets freely now hesitated in the shadows, calculating the odds of confrontation with a being whose reaction time and judgment exceeded that of any human enforcer. Even local gangs that operated with impunity recognized the inevitability of his presence. Unlike the Arbeits, whose fearsome reputation was bolstered by the promise of brutal punishment, RoboCop enforced law with impartiality, striking only when necessary and with precision that minimized unnecessary harm. This consistency began to instill a fragile sense of security among the civilians, who began moving with slightly more confidence, daring to retrieve resources or check on neighbors, trusting that the Metal Guardian would intervene if danger approached. Yet fear remained an undercurrent. Some citizens recoiled at the sound of his hydraulic servos, some crossed themselves or whispered warnings of heresy, unable to separate the machine from judgment. RoboCop's optics recorded these reactions, analyzing them for patterns that could inform future interactions. He adjusted his approach, moderating displays of force to balance deterrence with reassurance. In one encounter, a terrified worker brandishing a makeshift blade froze at the sight of him, eyes wide with panic. Rather than acting with lethal efficiency, RoboCop extended his servo-arm, grasping the weapon and disarming the civilian with minimal force, then issuing a calm, directive statement. Weapon is confiscated. You are safe. Move to a secure location. The man collapsed to his knees, relief and awe mingling in his expression, a testament to the complex interplay of fear, trust, and respect and authority that RoboCop had to navigate. Interactions were not limited to civilians alone. RoboCop began coordinating with smaller enforcement units and Arbeit squads, his presence amplifying their effectiveness. Civilians observed this cooperation with a mix of fascination and caution, noting the contrast between human judgment tempered by morality and machine precision guided by directives. Word spread quickly through the Hive sectors. A metal enforcer walked the streets, impartial, unyielding, yet capable of measured restraint when circumstances demanded. This reputation influenced behavior in subtle ways. Street gangs and minor cultists altered their routes, avoided certain sectors, and in some cases even dispersed without confrontation, the mere knowledge of RoboCop's presence acting as a deterrent. The psychological impact on citizens was not uniform. Children were drawn to him, seeing a living symbol of protection amidst a world defined by chaos and death. They mimicked his movements, playing at law enforcement in rubble-strewn alleys, their laughter a fragile counterpoint to the constant echo of artillery and screams. Adults, however, reacted with caution or skepticism. They had lived through centuries of tyranny, rebellion, and the relentless predations of chaos and Xenos alike. The notion that justice could be both impartial and effective was unfamiliar, almost alien. RoboCop's challenge lay in maintaining trust without creating dependency, reinforcing the concept of law as a stabilizing force rather than a tool of oppression. He also encountered situations where protection required difficult judgment calls. A group of civilians attempted to shield a minor cultist, pleading for mercy and invoking extenuating circumstances. RoboCop evaluated the scenario rapidly, weighing risk to innocent life, likelihood of future threats, and his directive to enforce law. With calculated precision, he separated the individual from the protective group, minimizing distress while maintaining control over the situation. His mechanical efficiency was tempered by the human fragments of his understanding, ensuring that enforcement did not devolve into cruelty or blind execution. As RoboCop patrolled the sectors, the citizens gradually adapted to his presence. Markets reopened in areas previously abandoned due to gang activity. Workers ventured further into unstable industrial zones to retrieve necessary supplies, guided by the knowledge that a vigilant enforcer was nearby. Even the whispers of heresy and fear of warp-tainted elements shifted slightly, as the population recognized that protection existed not solely through divine intervention, but through tangible, actionable presence. RoboCop's role became both practical and symbolic, a constant reminder that in a galaxy consumed by war and corruption, order could still be imposed, even if only temporarily, by a being whose determination and precision transcended the limitations of humanity alone. Every interaction reinforced the complexity of his mission. Civilians were not merely passive elements. Their perceptions, fears, and hopes were variables that he had to calculate and integrate. The balance between law enforcement, protection, and psychological influence required constant monitoring, adjustment, and judgment. The Hive City, with all its twisted alleys, industrial spires, and looming darkness, was more than a battlefield. It was a living organism, responding to his presence, reshaping itself subtly under the weight of his authority. Each choice, each measured action, rippled through the population, shaping the fragile equilibrium between fear and trust, chaos and order, machine precision and human understanding. The shriek of crude gunfire echoed through the Hive City streets as Robocop advanced cautiously, his enhanced optics picking out movement amid the smoke and debris. A warband of orcs had descended upon the industrial sector, their massive forms and jagged armor clashing with the delicate human structures around them. They bellowed and roared, a chaotic cacophony of guttural language and booming laughter, the sheer ferocity of their aggression amplified by their numbers. Robocop's targeting systems instantly highlighted each orc as a high-priority threat, marking trajectories, speed, and potential impact zones. His cybernetic mind calculated hundreds of potential outcomes within milliseconds, analyzing the optimal balance of force and precision to neutralize the onslaught while avoiding civilian casualties. Yet even as his systems worked flawlessly, the unpredictable nature of orc behavior challenged every assumption he had ever made about combat, requiring him to adapt dynamically to chaos that defied conventional logic. The first orc charged through the rubble, wielding a crude, serrated power axe, its massive frame propelled by sheer muscular strength. Robocop raised his plasma rifle and fired, calculating the perfect arc to intercept the orc mid-stride. The bolt struck with precision, igniting the crude armor but failing to fully stop the creature. The orc laughed, a thunderous guttural sound, swinging its axe with reckless abandon. Robocop adjusted instantly, deploying a servo-arm to deflect the incoming weapon, while simultaneously striking with reinforced power armor, sending the creature crashing into a pile of rubble. The other orcs hesitated for a fraction of a second, processing the efficiency and resilience of this new opponent. But their instinct for violence overcame caution, and the warband surged forward, a tide of muscle, metal, and madness. Robocop's internal systems calculated the spatial dynamics of the battlefield. The orcs moved in clusters, each subgroup supporting the others, with overlapping fire from crude shootas and rockets. Civilians and Arbites units were trapped in the crossfire, their positions constantly shifting. Robocop deployed his enhanced weaponry with meticulous care. Plasma bolts neutralized heavily armored threats, while gravitic disruptors sent clusters of orcs sprawling without lethally harming those caught in their path. The servo-arms allowed him to perform multiple actions simultaneously, restraining a fleeing civilian with one limb, firing a bolter with another, and manipulating the environment to block orc advance. His integration of 40K technology had transformed him from a law enforcer into a tactical juggernaut, capable of handling threats that would overwhelm conventional forces. Yet the orcs were unpredictable. One of the larger knobs, towering over his followers, charged directly at Robocop with a massive chain axe, the sheer momentum threatening to crush everything in its path. Robocop calculated the probability of success for a direct confrontation versus using the environment as leverage. He pivoted, using a fallen support beam to redirect the knob's momentum into a metal wall, while his servo-arm immobilized a nearby orc shooting a crude plasma gun. The knob toppled with a deafening crash, stunned but not defeated, its followers momentarily stunned by the efficiency and brutality of his response. Robocop recognized the psychological impact of his actions. Even among the orcs, creatures driven by instinct and bloodlust, There was a recognition that this enforcer was not easily subdued. Civilians scrambled to safer zones as Robocop's enhanced optics identified safe paths through the battlefield. The Hive City, with its collapsed structures and precarious walkways, required careful navigation to prevent further casualties. His system constantly recalculated threats and escape routes, overlaying potential hazards onto his HUD, guiding both his movements and those of civilians caught in the chaos. The orcs, relentless and unpredictable, tested the limits of his capabilities, forcing him to constantly adapt strategies in real time. He employed combination tactics, suppressive fire to corral groups, targeted plasma discharges to break through reinforced barricades, and calculated melee strikes to disable high-priority targets. Each action was a balance between mechanical precision and emergent judgment, a fusion of programming and the human instincts still embedded within him. As the battle raged, Robocop noted the tactical adaptability of the orcs. They were not merely mindless brutes. Their attacks were coordinated in an instinctual, chaotic intelligence that made conventional prediction difficult. One squad attempted to flank him through a collapsed corridor, using the debris as cover. Robocop anticipated the movement, deploying gravitic pulses to destabilize the rubble and redirect the orcs into a controlled kill zone. The clash was violent but measured, each strike calculated to neutralize threat without unnecessary destruction to the surrounding infrastructure. Civilians looked on in awe and fear, witnessing a level of control over chaos that seemed almost impossible in this grim-dark universe. The psychological warfare extended beyond raw force. Orc war cries, the clang of metal, and the stench of burning fuel created an oppressive atmosphere. Yet Robocop's internal systems filtered sensory input to focus on tactical priorities. He observed patterns, predicting orc behavior through probability matrices, and adapting his own movements with near-prescient accuracy. The enhanced bionics and weaponry allowed him to turn the tide of the skirmish repeatedly, maintaining a controlled offensive while minimizing collateral damage. Each defeated orc and each redirected attack reinforced his position as a dominant force, a being whose precision and authority could impose order even on the most chaotic and brutal of enemies. Despite the overwhelming odds, Robocop continued to advance, a singular figure of disciplined law enforcement and tactical superiority. His presence reshaped the battlefield dynamically, creating zones of relative safety amidst the orc onslaught. Civilians, Arbite squads, and even lesser combatants began to orient their actions around his movements, trusting in his judgment and capabilities. The warband, though fierce and relentless, began to fracture under the pressure of his calculated strikes, their instinctive brutality unable to match the combination of mechanical precision, enhanced weaponry, and emergent strategic reasoning. Through the smoke, the fire, and the chaos, Robocop maintained an unwavering focus. His mission was clear: protect the innocent, enforce law, and neutralize threats with efficiency and calculated judgment. The orcs' unpredictability challenged him at every turn, yet each encounter refined his strategies, honed his reflexes, and reinforced the human-machine synthesis that defined his presence. The battlefield became a proving ground, not only for his physical enhancements and 40K weaponry, but for the fusion of human reasoning and cybernetic perfection in the heart of one of the galaxy's most brutal conflicts. Robocop moved through the shadows of the Hive City's upper spires, his optics scanning the flickering lights of deserted walkways and abandoned maintenance platforms. Reports from Voxcasters indicated unusual activity, rogue inquisitors operating beyond Imperial sanction, their methods brutal and unchecked, and the potential for collateral damage among civilians alarmingly high. Robocop's internal directives process the information rapidly, uphold law, protect innocents, neutralize threats. Yet this situation was unlike any he had faced before. These were not ordinary criminals or Chaos Cultists. They were agents of the Imperium itself, empowered with authority that often skirted morality, yet bound by the oaths of service to the Emperor. The clash between rigid programming and the moral ambiguity of rogue Imperial enforcers created a conflict he had to navigate with precision, tact, and judgment. As he approached the first location, a spire overlooking a bustling industrial sector, Robocop observed the rogue Inquisitor manipulating armed Arbites and mercenaries with ruthless efficiency. Civilians were being corralled into narrow alleys, ostensibly for their protection, but the threat of indiscriminate punishment was evident. The Inquisitor barked orders, his voice amplified through Vox speakers, commanding lethal strikes against suspected heretics with little regard for proof or consequence. Robocop analyzed the scenario, recognizing the danger to innocents and the violation of structured law enforcement protocols. His cybernetic systems calculated multiple approaches: direct confrontation, stealth intervention, and tactical redirection of rogue units to minimize harm. Each option carried risk, both to himself and the citizens under threat. Yet inaction was not a choice. He chose a path of calculated intervention, moving silently along catwalks and maintenance ladders to gain the high ground. His enhanced optics allowed him to observe the Inquisitor's forces, predicting their movements and the trajectory of weapons fire. When the Inquisitor ordered a squad to execute a suspected heretic, Robocop deployed a non-lethal deterrent. Using servo-arms to disarm and restrain the aggressors while simultaneously shielding the civilians in the immediate area. His presence was sudden and undeniable, a metallic sentinel who executed the law with precision, indifferent to rank, status, or fear. The rogue Inquisitor turned, eyes widening at the unexpected intervention, his hand twitching toward his own weapon. Robocop's voice cut through the tension, calm, mechanical, and unwavering. Cease unauthorized actions. Civilians must remain unharmed. Law enforcement will be executed under established directives. The Inquisitor hesitated, calculating whether this was a threat to his authority or a disruption of his plans. For the first time, he encountered a force that did not recognize the trappings of rank or the intimidation of title. Robocop's programming was absolute, and his human-derived moral reasoning made him capable of understanding the consequences of unrestrained violence. The Inquisitor's men faltered, caught between loyalty, fear, and the realization that this enforcer would not be swayed by threats, bribes, or intimidation. Robocop's calculated approach neutralized the immediate danger, disarming weapons, restraining aggressive elements, and redirecting the civilians to safer zones while maintaining a clear stance of authority. Even as he enforced law, Robocop's systems were recording and analyzing behavior patterns, noting the subtleties of the rogue Inquisitor's commands and the morale of his forces. He recognized that authority without oversight often led to corruption and abuse, and in this instance, the threat was not merely to life, but to the moral integrity of enforcement itself. Civilians, who had been silently observing, began to respond differently, their fear tempered by awe and relief. They saw not just a machine, but a calculated arbiter of justice, capable of restraining even the agents of the Imperium from actions that would escalate chaos. The confrontation escalated as the rogue Inquisitor attempted a direct attack, deploying a psychic blast to intimidate and injure. RoboCop's enhanced sensory systems detected the warp signature in real time, allowing him to anticipate the attack and deploy a combination of kinetic shielding and gravitic stabilization to deflect the energy without harm to bystanders. Servo-arms immobilized the Inquisitor's immediate aides, their movements carefully controlled to prevent injury while eliminating the tactical advantage of surprise. The Inquisitor's psychic fury collided with RoboCop's calculated defenses, creating a spectacle that drew the attention of nearby citizens, who gasped at the sight of what seemed a battle between human will and machine precision. Throughout the encounter, RoboCop maintained a delicate balance between enforcement and restraint. His directives compelled him to uphold law impartially, yet his human reasoning allowed him to consider ethical implications in real time. When a minor heretic, barely conscious and racked with warp-tainted corruption, fell within the conflict zone, RoboCop acted decisively yet carefully, restraining the figure with non-lethal force and preventing execution by the rogue Inquisitor's forces. This action demonstrated not only superior tactical acumen, but also an understanding of proportional justice, an understanding that even in the 41st millennium, where life was cheap and authority absolute, law could be tempered with measured judgment. The rogue Inquisitor, frustrated and constrained by RoboCop's interventions, attempted further maneuvers, summoning reinforcements and leveraging intimidation tactics against civilians. RoboCop adapted continuously, integrating battlefield intelligence, predicting likely threats, and managing both human and mechanical variables in real time. His enhanced weaponry, servo-arms, and sensors allowed him to control multiple aspects of the encounters simultaneously, neutralizing aggressive elements, protecting innocents, and maintaining a clear tactical advantage. Each calculated action diminished the rogue Inquisitor's capacity for arbitrary violence, reshaping the power dynamics in the immediate sector and sending a message to both civilians and would-be violators that law enforcement could be precise, impartial, and effective. As the confrontation unfolded, RoboCop observed the broader implications. Authority, even in the hands of the Imperium's enforcers, was subject to corruption, personal ambition, and moral compromise. His presence challenged assumptions, both human and institutional, that might had always equated to justice. Civilians looked on, not merely at a machine, but at a being capable of reconciling absolute law with measured morality, capable of intervening in ways that preserved life while enforcing order. Rogue Inquisitor's movements became increasingly reactive, constrained by RoboCop's presence and the certainty of his judgment. The battle was not merely physical. It was a confrontation of philosophy, morality, and the practical application of law in a universe that offered few guarantees, where enforcement required both strength and insight, calculation and human empathy in equal measure. RoboCop moved through the labyrinthine underhives, his enhanced optics cutting through the thick smog and dim lighting, scanning constantly for threats both visible and hidden. The Hive city around him was alive with chaos, the distant rumble of artillery, the clash of orc mobs in the lower sectors, and the whispered mutterings of warp-tainted cultists filtering through twisted corridors. Each sensory input triggered a cascade of internal analyses, a ceaseless stream of probability matrices, tactical evaluations, and risk assessments. Yet beyond the physical threats, there was another force at work in this universe, one that his programming struggled to quantify: the psychological weight of relentless violence, corruption, and the omnipresent taint of the warp. His human consciousness, buried beneath layers of cybernetic directives, began to register the subtleties of this strain. The emotional and moral toll that the denizens of the 41st millennium endured daily. Every encounter, no matter how routine, carried with it the burden of moral ambiguity. Civilians who survived encounters with Chaos Cults were not simply victims. They were changed, hardened, or broken by what they had seen. Robocop observed their fear, the subtle hesitation in their movements, the flicker of distrust even toward those who meant them protection. His directives compelled him to enforce law, to safeguard innocence, and to neutralize threats. Yet the weight of repeated exposure to suffering created an emergent awareness that actions, no matter how precise, could never fully alleviate the trauma embedded in the city's population. Each intervention, each neutralization of a heretic or rogue psyker was successful in the tactical sense, yet the psychological landscape remained fractured, a complex web of fear, hope, and uncertainty that he had to account for. The warp, pervasive and insidious, introduced disturbances that even his enhanced sensors struggled to manage. Psykers screamed in the alleys, their psychic output manifesting in visible distortions and spectral apparitions that flickered across walls and ceilings. Robocop's targeting arrays locked on to these anomalies, calculating containment or neutralization strategies, yet the psychic noise affected him in ways beyond his initial programming. The visions, echoes, and whispers of the warp pressed against his cognition, probing at the boundaries between machine logic and human perception. He experienced what could only be described as mental strain, the feeling of being observed, judged, and tested by forces that had no regard for mortal reasoning. His cybernetic mind filtered much of it, yet the residual impressions lingered, creating a subtle tension that affected decision-making and situational awareness. Even in combat, the psychological pressure was palpable. Orc warbands, rogue inquisitors, and chaos cultists were not merely threats to be eliminated. They were embodiments of the constant, unrelenting stress that defined the 41st millennium. Each encounter required rapid recalibration of tactics, moral judgment, and situational ethics. When civilians attempted to intervene or shield perpetrators, Robocop had to navigate the delicate balance between enforcing law and preventing undue harm. Each decision carried ramifications that extended beyond immediate outcomes, influencing the perception of authority, the behavior of citizens, and the survival of the broader population. The weight of responsibility was amplified by his awareness that the galaxy itself was indifferent, that for every life saved, countless others were lost to the endless tide of war. The strain of constant exposure to suffering manifested in subtle ways. Robocop's processors registered minor fluctuations in response time, increased internal cooling cycles due to repeated combat stress, and heightened alertness to even the smallest anomalies. His human consciousness, however, registered the emotional undercurrent, the fear, desperation, and grief etched into the faces of those he protected. Civilians whispered about him, some calling him a savior, others a harbinger of cold judgment. These divergent perceptions created a paradox within his programming: how to enforce law impartially while navigating the emotional landscape of a population shaped by trauma, superstition, and survival instincts honed under unending conflict. As he patrolled deeper into the Hive, RoboCop encountered clusters of civilians who had been subjected to prolonged exposure to chaos corruption. Their behavior was erratic. Some were violent, others catatonic, all marked by the psychological imprint of repeated trauma. His directives required containment and protection, yet the ethical implications of his interventions weighed heavily. He deployed non-lethal restraints, organized evacuation corridors, and administered medical stabilization where possible, all while maintaining full situational awareness of potential combat threats. Each action demanded simultaneous attention to tactical, ethical, and psychological variables, a complex balancing act that tested the limits of both his cybernetic enhancements and his emergent human reasoning. The longer RoboCop operated in this environment, the more the line between man and machine blurred. His human cognition began integrating with his cybernetic systems in a feedback loop, analyzing not only immediate threats, but the long-term consequences of intervention, the ripple effects on civilian morale, and the subtle shifts in gang and cultist behavior in response to his presence. The psychological strain of the universe manifested not just externally, but internally, as he grappled with the existential weight of enacting justice in a galaxy where morality was often a subjective and fluid concept. His ability to process trauma, both his own and that observed in others, became as crucial as his weapon systems, armor, and tactical algorithms, shaping him into an enforcer uniquely capable of operating in the relentless pressures of the 41st millennium. Even in moments of temporary calm, RoboCop's awareness did not rest. He monitored civilian reactions, analyzed patterns of fear and trust, and predicted areas of potential conflict before they erupted. The warp-tainted energies in the environment created subtle disturbances in his perception, and his human consciousness absorbed the cumulative weight of countless deaths, acts of cruelty, and instances of bravery witnessed across the Hive. Each step he took, each intervention he made, carried with it not only physical consequences, but the subtle burden of psychological influence, reshaping the city and its inhabitants while testing the boundaries of his own mental resilience. The Hive City, a sprawling network of steel, smoke, and shadow, became both a battlefield and a mirror for RoboCop's own emergent understanding. Every encounter reinforced the truth that law enforcement in the 41st millennium was more than tactical proficiency or mechanical efficiency. It was a continuous negotiation with the unpredictable, the immoral, and the traumatic, requiring a synthesis of human empathy and cybernetic precision to navigate the unending horrors of a galaxy where psychological strain was as pervasive and deadly as any weapon. RoboCop advanced into the heart of the Hive City, where entire sectors had fallen under the influence of Chaos Cultists and rogue Psykers. The streets were lined with the wreckage of industrial machinery, abandoned vehicles, and the remnants of civilians who had fled or perished in previous skirmishes. Smoke curled in thick plumes from overturned fuel tanks, and the acrid stench of burning plastics and ozone filled the air, blending with the lingering psychic taint that made the atmosphere itself oppressive. Every step he took was calculated. His reinforced boots crunched over rubble, servo joints whirring softly as his enhanced optics scanned for movement, heat signatures, and warp-tainted anomalies. This was not merely a mission of neutralization. It was a campaign to impose structure and enforce law in a place where chaos had long ruled unchecked. The first objective was to establish a controlled zone, a sector where civilians could find temporary safety and where his authority would act as a stabilizing influence. He identified a central square partially intact amidst the destruction, its surrounding buildings providing natural choke points to control ingress and egress. Civilians, cautious and wary, began emerging from side alleys, drawn by the presence of a protector who moved with precision and authority. Robocop issued directives in his metallic, calm voice, instructing them to congregate in designated safe areas, avoid unstable structures, and remain alert to threats. His servo-arms assisted in physically guiding the more hesitant citizens, lifting debris where necessary, and ensuring that the flow of people remained orderly despite their panic and confusion. Chaos Cultists and Warp-tainted Psykers quickly realized the emergence of the controlled zone and attempted to infiltrate it, testing his defenses with sporadic gunfire, psychic attacks, and ambushes. Robocop responded with a combination of precision fire and non-lethal containment measures, neutralizing threats efficiently while minimizing harm to civilians and infrastructure. His gravitic disruptors and servo-arm-assisted shields allowed him to create moving barriers, pushing back aggressors and redirecting the chaos of battle into controlled channels. Each intervention was calculated to maintain the integrity of the zone, demonstrating not only tactical superiority, but the practical application of law in a fractured urban environment. As he fortified the area, Robocop coordinated with surviving Arbeits units and local militia who had survived previous raids. His communication systems interfaced directly with Vox networks, providing real-time updates on enemy movements, civilian locations, and environmental hazards. Together, they established checkpoints, patrol routes, and evacuation corridors, creating a layered system of control that extended beyond simple enforcement. Civilians, initially fearful and mistrustful, began to recognize the stability that his presence created. Mothers allowed children to play cautiously in partially cleared areas. Merchants reopened small stalls to distribute essentials, and workers ventured into previously abandoned factories to salvage resources, all under the watchful gaze of a cybernetic enforcer whose precision and authority had turned a war-torn sector into a temporary bastion of order. Yet threats were never static. Rogue Psykers operating from hidden alcoves and derelict buildings attempted to manipulate civilians, sow confusion, and disrupt his controlled zones. Robocop adapted, employing psychic dampening arrays scavenged from abandoned mechanicum facilities, coupled with his enhanced optics to identify and isolate warp signatures. When one Psyker unleashed a psychic scream that caused structural tremors and hallucinations, he deployed servo-arms to physically stabilize critical support beams while simultaneously targeting the source of the psychic interference. Civilians were shielded from harm, and the threat was neutralized without excessive force. An approach that combined technological sophistication with situational awareness and emergent human judgment. The creation of controlled zones also required psychological management. Civilians, traumatized by constant exposure to chaos, needed reassurance beyond mere physical protection. RoboCop's presence became a focal point, a symbol of law and reliability in an otherwise unpredictable environment. He observed subtle behaviors, hesitation in movement, signs of panic, the ways children clung to adults while scanning for danger. Adjusting his approach, he modified patrol patterns, provided visible reassurance through deliberate movements, and used his servo-arms to physically aid those who were hesitant or injured. Each intervention reinforced the perception that the zone was under his control, creating a feedback loop of trust and order that extended through the surrounding A. Encounters with hostile forces highlighted the difficulty of maintaining law in a universe dominated by chaos. Orc raiding parties attempted to overrun checkpoints. Cultists attempted sabotage, and rogue Imperial agents tested his authority, exploiting ambiguities in human behavior. RoboCop adapted dynamically, balancing offensive and defensive measures, neutralizing threats efficiently, while maintaining the psychological stability of civilians. His enhanced bionics, weaponry, and tactical awareness allowed him to manage multiple simultaneous engagements without compromising the safety of those under his protection. Each success in defending a controlled zone further expanded his influence, deterring would-be aggressors and providing a tangible example of the enforcement of law in a galaxy where authority was often arbitrary or non-existent. The longer he maintained the sector, the more RoboCop began to observe patterns of behavior in both civilians and aggressors. Cultists and mutants adapted their tactics, civilians adapted their movement, and Arbites units adjusted their patrols to leverage his capabilities. This dynamic system required constant monitoring, calculation, and intervention, reinforcing the complexity of law enforcement in a chaotic universe. RoboCop became more than an enforcer. He became a stabilizing force, a catalyst for temporary order in a city defined by unending violence and corruption. His actions demonstrated that even amidst the horrors of the 41st millennium, structure, authority, and protection could be imposed, if only through the combination of human judgment and cybernetic precision. Every success reinforced a broader understanding. Law enforcement in the Hive city was not merely a matter of neutralizing threats. It required strategic foresight, technological adaptation, moral judgment, and psychological insight. RoboCop's controlled zones served as microcosms of order within chaos, spaces where civilians could experience relative safety, where justice could be enacted without arbitrary cruelty, and where the principles of law could coexist with the realities of survival in a universe that often made neither easy. His presence reshaped the physical and psychological landscape, transforming a shattered, fear-dominated sector into a network of controlled, defended, and functional spaces, demonstrating that even in the 41st millennium, law and order could assert themselves against overwhelming adversity. RoboCop advanced toward the epicenter of the Chaos Uprising, the air thick with smoke, the acrid tang of burning fuel, and the metallic scent of blood. The Hive city's normally chaotic streets had transformed into a war zone, barricades erected hastily, and civilians trapped in pockets between hostile forces. The uprising had been coordinated, orchestrated by a cabal of rogue cultists and warp-tainted Psykers who had seized control of critical supply nodes and communication relays. Their influence extended through both the underhives and the partially intact upper sectors, creating a network of destabilization that threatened to spread unchecked. RoboCop's objective was clear: restore order, protect civilians, neutralize threats, and coordinate any surviving Imperial forces into a coherent defensive network, all while navigating the moral complexities inherent in punishing those driven by chaos. The initial approach was fraught with danger. Orc warbands clashed with insurgent cultists in the streets, their combined aggression creating unpredictable hazards. Bolts of psychic energy streaked across streets, igniting structures and collapsing scaffolding, while armed cultists fired indiscriminately from rooftops and alleys. Civilians fled in panic, some running into deadly crossfire, others frozen with fear. Robocop sensors map the chaos in real time, highlighting threats, safe paths, and structural vulnerabilities. His enhanced bionics allowed him to navigate the treacherous terrain with precision, leaping across gaps, stabilizing crumbling walkways, and deflecting attacks with reinforced armor. Every movement was calculated, a balance between offensive capability and the protection of innocents caught in the middle. He established a series of controlled engagement zones, leveraging the rubble and surviving infrastructure to funnel hostile forces into areas where they could be neutralized efficiently. Servo-arms deployed barriers, redirected debris, and physically restrained combatants, while his integrated weaponry delivered precise, overwhelming force to high-priority targets. Bolter rounds pierced reinforced cultist armor. Plasma discharges incinerated orc mobs threatening to breach civilian zones, and gravitic pulses destabilized barricades used by aggressors while leaving civilian structures intact. Each engagement was executed with meticulous attention to minimizing collateral damage while maximizing tactical efficiency, a fusion of human judgment and cybernetic calculation that proved unparalleled in the battlefield conditions of the Hive city. Civilians, initially terrified, began to respond to Robocop's presence with cautious trust. Mothers and children were guided to secured sectors, artisans and laborers were marshaled to reinforce barriers, and surviving Arbeit squads coordinated with him to extend patrol coverage and reinforce choke points. Robocop's communication systems allowed him to relay real-time instructions, issue warnings, and coordinate tactical maneuvers across multiple units simultaneously. His presence had a dual effect, neutralizing threats directly while instilling a psychological sense of order that altered both civilian and insurgent behavior. Even the rogue cultists, witnessing his precision and impartiality, hesitated in their assaults, their unpredictability mitigated by the certainty of Robocop's interventions. One of the more formidable threats emerged in the form of a Warp-tainted Psyker who attempted to summon a localized demonic incursion. Robocop's enhanced sensors detected the psychic signature before the manifestation fully coalesced. He deployed an electromagnetic pulse from his servo-arm, destabilizing the warp conduit and dispersing the emerging entities before they could materialize in full form. Simultaneously, bolter fire and plasma discharges suppressed cultist combatants attempting to protect the Psyker. Civilians were guided to safety behind stabilized barricades, and structural integrity was maintained despite the intensity of the psychic backlash. Robocop's ability to integrate offensive and defensive measures in real time highlighted the necessity of both human judgment and machine precision in confronting forces that defied conventional tactics. The uprising's coordination posed a unique challenge. Multiple cultist factions attempted to flank his position, exploiting the natural labyrinth of the Hive city to create crossfire situations and ambushes. RoboCop's internal calculations ran hundreds of predictive scenarios per second, enabling him to anticipate movements, pre-position forces, and create controlled kill zones. Servo-arms restrained and redirected hostile combatants, while automated turrets, salvaged from abandoned manufacturums, delivered precise fire on critical targets. Each victory reinforced the controlled sectors, progressively expanding the areas under RoboCop's effective control. Civilians began to emerge more confidently, assisting in minor logistical tasks, retrieving supplies, and providing reconnaissance on enemy movements. Their behavior influenced by the order that RoboCop imposed. Despite his mechanical efficiency, RoboCop's human cognition remained active, allowing him to interpret moral and ethical nuances. Some insurgents were coerced civilians or minor cultists driven by desperation, their intentions not fully aligned with the Chaos agenda. RoboCop made calculated decisions to restrain rather than kill where possible, prioritizing rehabilitation and intelligence gathering while still maintaining overall control of the battlefield. This approach not only preserved lives but enhanced the psychological impact of his presence. Civilians witnessed enforcement tempered by discernment. Insurgents recognized that law could be decisive yet proportionate, and the rogue Psykers and Orc elements realized that chaos and brutality alone could not triumph over methodical precision. As the battle continued, RoboCop integrated multiple layers of control: physical dominance, tactical coordination with Arbites and civilians, real-time monitoring of psychic and warp disturbances, and psychological management of population behavior. Each intervention reinforced the others, creating a feedback loop that steadily eroded the insurgents' operational capacity while expanding safe zones and securing essential infrastructure. Civilians increasingly relied on his guidance, following his movements and instructions to navigate debris-strewn streets, avoid ambushes, and participate in reinforcing defensive measures. By the time the main engagement reached its peak, RoboCop had effectively transformed the chaotic Hive into a structured battlefield. Rogue cultists were contained, Orc mobs suppressed, and Warp-tainted Psykers neutralized or restrained. Civilians were secured in reinforced sectors, with pathways cleared for supplies and emergency response. His actions demonstrated a comprehensive mastery of the interplay between tactical enforcement, moral judgment, and population management. Each calculated move reinforced law and order, illustrating that even amidst the unrelenting violence and corruption of the 41st millennium, a single enforcer equipped with advanced cybernetics, 40K technology, and human insight could restore structure, impose